silent. And then in the minutiae of the female reproductive cycle, as we get into it, you seem to have greater interest. So very odd to predict. In any case, make sure you know this terminology. So it's kind of an artificial terminology. I've never really cared for it, but nevertheless, we are going to artificially or factitiously differentiate the uterine, which we're also calling the menstrual cycle, from this ovarian cycle. And I think our focus is primarily on the ovarian cycle. You'll notice the ovarian cycle, as it applies to folliculogenesis, has three phases, arguably three phases. There's the follicular phase, which is the phase prior to ovulation. Again, the follicular phase is the term used to describe the pre-ovulatory days of the monthly cycle and the ovarian cycle. Notice we have a different set of terms for the uterine cycle. Then there's ovulation, which is release of the oocyte. And then the final phase, the phase of the monthly cycle or the ovarian cycle that occurs after ovulation, is called the luteal phase. And that suggests the importance of that yellow body.
I was under the impression that a mature follicle takes 350 days to mature.
Well, no. What we're saying is that it takes about a year for the primordial follicle to fully differentiate into a mature follicle.
So the pictures up here,
pictures
the
are
little cell to the big
correct.
cell.
Incorrect, yeah. And that's the point I was trying, and in the slides I mentioned that a couple of times. It's just I'm trying to be as parsimonious as possible in here with my terms so we can go. You're exactly right. This is inaccurate, and I can't tell you how many tutorials in reproductive physiology have that built into them, but the textbook authors never seem to incorporate it. And perhaps it's an unimportant complication. I don't know, but I think it is important that you understand that it's only this component that's really monthly. It's that final selection process. All right. So as I say, we're primarily interested in the ovarian cycle, but before we leave that, or as we discuss that further, make sure you note the correspondence between the stages of the ovarian cycle. In fact, let me go back to this illustration. The correspondence, for example, between the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle and the menstrual and proliferative phases of the uterine cycle. So these terms down here describe the phases of the menstrual or uterine cycle. These terms refer to the folliculogenesis or ovarian cycle. So as you look at the two rows there, the luteal phase then would correspond to the secretory phase of the uterine cycle. Day 14 is going to be our putative day of ovulation. Well, yeah, we won't get into that. And as I say, I've given you quite a few illustrations here. We're going to talk about some of the changes that occur in these developmental stages. We're primarily focusing on these endocrine relationships. But maybe one very good way or one very simple way to work through this is to look at this illustration over here. And this is one that I would encourage you again to expand. This is not a Netter's, so I'm not sure where I obtained that. But it is a little bit odd, and then we have to begin up here at the top right. So as we begin our exploration of these endocrine changes, we'll begin up there at the top right with the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus releases gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which is going to promote release of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary. Nothing surprising there. And as FSH and LH levels go up, normally, you would expect ovarian production of estrogen to increase. That's what our little figure shows us. But the other thing that happens after about the first week, and that's why I say none of these illustrations are quite correct, but after about the first week, the follicles are going to become more sensitive to the gonadotropins, especially FSH. And this causes or begins what is called the estrogen surge. And you see it right here, the estrogen surge. And notice that at about day, again, this isn't so accurate, but day 10, day 12, estrogen levels peak. Now, The curious thing that happens at this point is that for reasons that are not clear, the reproductive system goes into positive feedback. Remember, there normally should be an inverse relationship between gonadotropin levels and primary hormone levels, but that doesn't happen. Look what happens as estrogen goes up. Estrogen increases, and then that is followed at about day 12 by the LH surge. So instead of inhibiting the gonadotropins, estrogen promotes release of LH. So we get the LH surge here from the pituitary. And that sets in motion a complex sequence of events that involves everything from endocrinological changes to the expression of some 80 to 90 more proteins that are otherwise present in the female. But in any case, the LH surge immediately precedes ovulation. Ovulation normally occurs at day 14 there. Extrusion of the oocyte along with its granulosa cells. So after ovulation, you'll notice here both primary hormones go up, especially progesterone. So estrogen levels go up and progesterone levels go up for slightly different reasons, but primarily because of the endocrine activity of this thing, the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is cranking out copious amounts of progesterone in particular. And there is a relative restoration of inhibitory or negative feedback, such that now the gonadotropins go back to their more or less resting or original, their fairly low levels. Gonadotropin releasing hormone also decreases as a consequence of that negative feedback. Gonadotropins from the anterior pituitary gland are depressed, as is illustrated down here. And then that takes us back to the hypothalamus, and we start all over again with each monthly cycle. So that is a quick summary of the hormonal changes that occur in the ovarian cycle as they coincide with the follicular changes. But I would invite you to spend some time with this because this is a nice summary. Notice that it even throws in the phases of the menstrual cycle in there as well.
A primordial follicle consists of an oocyte surrounded by a single layer of squamous granulosa cells. A primordial follicle becomes a primary follicle as the granulosa cells become enlarged and cuboidal. The primary follicle enlarges and the granulosa cells form more than one layer. The zona pellucida forms around the oocyte. The structure is called a secondary follicle when fluid-filled vesicles develop among the granulosa cells and a well-developed capsule, or theca, becomes apparent around the granulosa cells.
He did mention one thing that may be useful to, I can't draw this, but that little white ring around the oocyte, he called that the zona pellucida. Eventually, that's going to become sort of a glycoprotein film. And it's only important because that's another barrier to fertilization. We're going to find that for the spermatocyte to fertilize the egg, it has to go through a variety of these little exterior structures. But as that white zona pellucida, just means clear zone, becomes this glycoprotein mucilaginous coating, it presents a bit of a barrier for fertilization.
The theca possesses internal and external layers. The structure is called a mature follicle when the fluid-filled vesicles form a single antrum. At full maturity, the oocyte is located in the cumulus mass. During ovulation, the oocyte is released from the follicle, along with some surrounding granulosa cells of the cumulus mass, called the corona radiata. Following ovulation, the granulosa cells divide rapidly and enlarge to form the yellow corpus luteum. When the corpus luteum degenerates, it forms the white corpus albicans.
So we took us through the various stages of the follicular genesis, but let's go back, let's harken back to the follicular phase because we still need to point out a few details that are occurring there. I don't know if I can move that thing back without it. Remember he talked about these thecal cells here. He talked about two layers of thecal cells. The thecal is the test or shell that surrounds this entire developing follicle. And what tends to happen, remember, the ovary is not only the tissue responsible for gametogenesis. The ovary is also the endocrine tissue that releases the primary hormones, in this case, estrogen. And this is happening, we talked about this important relationship between gametogenesis and steroidogenesis before. But what's happening in those thecal cells is that the thecal cells are manufacturing or synthesizing testosterone. Isn't that a hoot? And then the testosterone is going to be aromatized into what? Estrogen, and that will occur in the granulosa cells. Does this sound familiar? Into the granulosa cells. How does the testosterone that is formed in the thecal shell get into or come into contact with the granulosa cell? Yeah, this goes right on through it. So it's going to be a function of concentration. So testosterone production or androgen production here, diffusion into the region of the granulosa cells where aromatization occurs, sometimes called the two-cell production hypothesis, I guess, Aurora hypothesis. And as usual, I broke my presentation. Now, be careful with these. We have a little animation we're going to look at in just a moment. Be careful with this. I was looking at this the other day. I noticed it could be misleading. Now, these notes that I've made over here refer to the final week, the second week of the follicular phase. So these notes only apply to the second week of the follicular phase. There's going to be maturation of one follicle, and usually one. All the others are going to regress. We had a term for that, aphasia. And initially, in that second week, the estrogen will inhibit release of the gonadotropins. The LH is going to be increasing during this period. And there will also be, again, if you look at if you go back to, I hesitate to do this, but if you look back at our little list here, notice that consistently LH is generally a little, LH and FSH are both fairly low. Again, I don't necessarily like that figure. But if I have one, let's go back. So I don't know that this is a whole lot better, but you'll notice that both of these are fairly low. But as we move into that second week, LH levels tend to go up. FSH do too, but at a much slower rate. And initially, FSH is actually depressed. It's actually going the opposite direction than LH. So there's going to be the estrogen surge. The estrogen surge is going to trigger the luteinizing hormone surge, or the LH surge. There will also be an increase in FSH, but you'll notice it's much, much smaller than the increase in LH that occurs following the initiation of positive feedback. So again, as you look at this animation, the primary source of confusion here is that this is only talking about the few days prior to ovulation. This does not apply at any other time during the ovarian cycle.
During the menstrual cycle, before ovulation, small amounts of estrogen are secreted from the ovary. Estrogen stimulates the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary.
Should that happen? What should be the effect of estrogen on the pituitary and hypothalamus? Inhibition, right? So this is very strange, very unexpected, occurring right before ovulation.
Gonadotropin-releasing hormone also stimulates release of luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary. Luteinizing hormone, in turn, causes release of additional estrogen from the ovary. The levels of gonadotropin-releasing hormone and luteinizing hormone increase in the blood due to this positive feedback effect. After ovulation, the corpus luteum is formed in the ovary and begins to secrete progesterone in response to luteinizing hormone. Progesterone inhibits the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary.
A red color.
Blood levels of gonadotropin-releasing hormone and luteinizing hormone decrease because of this negative feedback effect.
So again, initially just before ovulation, positive feedback, then a restoration of the normal inhibitory feedback. So much so, you get sufficient amounts of LH in the blood just before ovulation. What are we looking at here? Now, the luteinizing hormone is a fairly small peptide. It actually is filtered in sufficient concentrations. It actually shows up in the urine and can therefore be used as a marker for the stage of the ovulatory cycle.
Ovulation is a
Turn the volume up here.
part of the menstrual cycle when the ovary releases a ripe egg, or ovum. Inside the ovary are hundreds of thousands of follicles. Each follicle is a hollow ball of cells with an immature egg in the center. The typical 28-day menstrual cycle begins on the first day of menstrual bleeding. During the first 7 days of the cycle, a few follicles begin to grow at the same time. These maturing follicles secrete estrogen hormone into the bloodstream to prepare the lining of the uterus for pregnancy. Around day 7, all of the follicles stop growing and begin to degenerate, except for one. This dominant follicle continues to grow and nourishes the developing egg inside it.
She keeps using that word, and one of the questions I asked you earlier, what constitutes a male or female? I'm still challenging any one of you to give me a biological definition based upon our developmental discussion. But what is an egg? What constitutes an egg in this context? What should the proper term be here? Oocyte. So what is an egg? And when does it appear?
Around day 12, the follicle secretes a large amount of estrogen into the bloodstream. When the estrogen reaches the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland in the brain, the anterior or front part of the pituitary gland releases a huge surge of luteinizing hormone into the bloodstream. Around day 14, luteinizing hormone causes the follicle to undergo a sudden growth spurt. Right before ovulation, the egg detaches from the inside of the follicle. The bulging follicle releases chemicals, causing one of the two fallopian tubes to move in closer and surround the follicle.
It's rather menacing to me.
The follicle swells until it bursts open, ejecting the egg and fluid from the follicle into the abdominal cavity. In response, the fimbriae, tiny projections at the end of the fallopian tube, sweep across the ovulation site and pick up the egg. Microscopic cilia on the fimbriae surface transport the egg to the entrance of the fallopian tube. Inside the walls of the fallopian tube, muscular contractions gently push the egg towards the uterus. After ovulation, the egg lives for 12 to 24 hours, so it must be fertilized by a sperm from the male during this time for a woman to become pregnant. If it's not fertilized, the egg dissolves away and is shed along with the uterine lining during menstruation.
Another question I have for you is, why is it so darn bright in there? What's going on back there? Not going to the light, that wouldn't be a good idea either in the circumstance. That troubles me. The explanations that I can come up with are not necessarily. There we go again. I ruined my. All right. So we saw ovulation occurring in that particular animation. it's sort of portrayed it as an explosion. That's sometimes how it's described. Most of the case reports show it's not an explosion, though it's much calmer, much more gentle event. But in any case, during ovulation, it is this entire structure that is extruded from the ovary, and then you saw it taken into the fimbrium. The process is not completely understood. It involves everything from inflammatory responses, release of inflammatory chemicals. The size of the structure increases, but the current thinking is that ovulation occurs when the wall breaks down. It moves over in the opposite direction, and the wall simply gives way at some point, and that's the site of expulsion. As you can see, there's just almost 100 genes that are transcribed after the LH surge. Very complex process, probably involving multiple enzymes, regulatory processes, additional receptors, you name it. The whole gamut is probably involved. I thought I had an illustration. In any case, we're looking at the ovulation event here. So if ovulation is occurring here, the oocyte and the granulosa cells will be taken up into the fimbrium and transported by ciliary action down the fallopian tube. And there's usually going to be fertilization somewhere in the fallopian tube, which of course increases the portal workload for that spermatozoa. That's quite a distance to travel. And even if one of these is missing, it doesn't seem to impair fertility. Normally in the female, the two sides will alternate, but that doesn't seem to be a problem for individuals who have only one functional side. Of course, here we're looking at that fimbrium. Doesn't look so menacing now, but I don't think I'd want to tangle with it. Here was the set of figures that I was talking about. So the ovary is the white thing in the background there, and you can see the ovulation of the egg and the granulosa cells. So you can sort of see it occurring. It took 15 minutes to complete in this particular case study. So not the explosion that is normally portrayed. All right, that takes us into the luteal phase. We've indicated that the remnants, the residue of that follicle following ovulation sort of undergoes a histological involution to form this yellow body or corpus luteum, which we said is important endocrinologically because it's now the tissue which secretes the very copious amounts of progesterone. Also estrogen, but to a much lesser extent. Now, with respect to the function of these, or the discussion of what's happening to the uterine lining, I'm going to defer that discussion to just a moment. But remember our use of the term atresia and atretic follicles. If fertilization does not occur, the corpus luteum will eventually undergo complete degeneration to become the sort of small mass of scar tissue. So if you think about the changes that occur in the ovary with aging, you have something of a sort of a lunar landscape, several potential sites of ovulation, and then inside the tissue, the regressing tissue, would be increasing numbers of white bodies and scar tissue as opposed to potentially functional follicles. In the animation, the narrator spoke of the narrow window, the fact that the egg is only going to be viable. Again, what's an egg? Egg is only going to be viable for a couple days at most. The sperm is only going to be available and functional for a couple of days. There's favorable circumstances, so very narrow, short window in which fertilization can occur productively. And so this is just my way because of indicating that it's so much of what we try to explain in physiology is just not completely understood. There's a fellow, Stuart Firestone, who wrote a book on how much we don't know and how important that can be to the process of science. But just look at the list here. We don't know, for example, what triggers the monthly cycle. Where does the word month, or if it's the monthly cycle, where does the word month come from? M-O-N. Lunar. Is it a circadian? Is it a solar sidereal cycle or some other phenomenon that triggers it? There is a peptide called kisspeptin that seems to be very important in beginning the initiation of the female reproductive cycles, but we don't know if it plays a role in the initiation of the monthly cycles or not. So that's a pretty fundamental question that cannot be answered. What begins the positive feedback? We can say that it's the estrogen surge, but if you increase estrogen levels at any other point in the ovarian cycle, you do not get the positive feedback. So there must be more to it than that. What terminates the positive feedback? How do the fecal and granulosa cells switch from androgens to progestogens? We'll talk about those in just a moment. What initiates labor? You saw in one of those previous animations that oxytocin is responsible for the contractions. Well, oxytocin is necessary for those contractions to occur, but we don't know what causes the increase in oxytocin, and we don't know, for example, oxytocin applied in other circumstances will not induce those muscular contractions. So very complex. Regulation of LH and FSH not thoroughly understood. How the FSH receptors do not downregulate in response to the increased concentration. What triggers atresia? We could just go on and on. So let's talk a little bit about the menstrual cycle. I'm going to summarize this fairly quickly. Talking again with respect to the menstrual cycle about the changes that occur in the uterine lining, the endometrium and the myometrium. Typically, under normal circumstances, one would anticipate menstruation occurring every 28 days or so. Depends on a variety of factors, and typically lasts for about 4 days. And you can see the extensive variability present among individuals. And we'll talk a little bit about factors that might inhibit normal menstruation. Typically, the first menstrual period, we call that menarche, begins again around puberty. Puberty is going to be highly variable too, but we'll just say at about the age of 13, and will continue until about menopause. Menopause does not seem to be affected by socioeconomic status. In other words, it's about age 51 in most cultures, most societies. There are a number of things that talks about pregnancy and lactation here, which will interrupt this normal menstrual cycle. Now, there's a brief discussion here of what the function of all of this is. In general, the menstrual cycle is intended naturally to prepare the cervical lining for implantation of the fertilized egg. That's what it's all about. That's the whole function. And if that implantation does not occur, then all of the housekeeping that was undertaken to prepare for that event it's removed from the house, and the whole business is started over again. And we'll talk about these two phases. In general, when we talk about the proliferative and the secretory phase, in the proliferative phase, I guess two important things are happening. The endometrial lining is increasing in thickness, and in the prevalence or relative abundance of blood vessels and glands is increasing in preparation for implantation. So that's the first thing. Proliferative phase is preparation for implantation. The other thing that happens, the other important sequence of events that occurs in the proliferative phase is the endometrial mucosa is altered to favor movement or migration of the spermatozoa. So it's sort of paving the way. Now, after ovulation, things change. Presumably, implantation has occurred following ovulation, and now the endometrial lining, and for that matter, parts of the myometrium, are now undergoing changes not to prepare for implantation, but to sustain implantation. You still have an increased vascularity and increased copious abundance of glands. But in addition to that, in the secretory phase, would you want spermatozoa at this point traveling upstream? Would you want the salmon coming upriver? No. So the mucosa becomes it's sometimes likened to the crust on a Krispy Kreme donut. It becomes now very thick and difficult to transit. So the mucosa now inhibits further movement of the spermatozoa.
The ovarian and uterine cycles are controlled by an interplay of hormones. Select an option.
Oh, what did it?
The ovarian and uterine cycles are tightly coordinated. Hormones secreted by the ovary at different phases of the ovarian cycle trigger changes in the uterine lining. For example, at the beginning of the cycles, the levels of estrogen and progesterone are too low to maintain the uterine lining, and menses begins. About a week into the ovarian cycle, the developing follicle increases its secretion of estrogen, and estrogen levels in the body begin to rise. This hormone triggers the cells of the uterine lining to proliferate, and the lining becomes thicker. Just before ovulation, the level of estrogen in the body has reached its peak. Afterward, the follicle cells remaining in the ovary develop into the corpus luteum, a structure that releases estrogen and progesterone. The hormones maintain the uterine lining at a peak thickness and preparedness for embryo implantation. At the end of the cycle, if the egg is not fertilized or has not implanted, the corpus luteum breaks down and stops releasing estrogen and progesterone. Without these hormones, the uterine lining also breaks down, initiating menses.
So you can see the slightly different representation of the relationship between estrogen and progesterone. But initially, prior to ovulation, estrogen is sort of the preparatory hormone. Afterward, progesterone released from the corpus luteum is going to be more important in maintaining and sustaining the increased thickness of the endometrial wall. We indicated that a number of factors can affect normal menstruation. Certainly, there has to be appropriate pulsatile signaling from the hypothalamus. The gonadotropin-releasing hormone must be released in a pulsatile fashion at the appropriate times and be at the appropriate amounts. We talked, for example, about Kallmann syndrome when we talked about hypothalamic disorders that could lead to hypogonadism in the male. Well, likewise, not only does the hypothalamus have to respond to the signals that it's receiving, and we can talk about those a little later if you like, but then the FSH and LH also have to be released in response to the gonadotropin. There are a number of disorders in which that does not occur. The ovaries then have to respond appropriately to the gonadotropins at the various points as LH and FSH levels go up. For example, you saw there was a brief increase in estrogen in the first week, and then the estrogen surge just prior to ovulation. And then finally, even if all of that is true, in order for menstruation to occur normally, there must be a functional endometrium capable of proliferation. By proliferation, we mean an increase, a time-appropriate increase in the vascularity. They're called spiral arteries and spiral glands. But these structures both have to proliferate. Proliferate means to increase in number. You have a couple of types of amenorrhea with which you should be familiar. By primary amenorrhea, we're talking about basically a delay in the onset of menstruation, a developmental delay. And that could be for any number of reasons. But if menstruation has not initiated or begun by age 16, then that's often a cause for concern. And usually the most common cause of primary amenorrhea is anything that delays the growth or development of the child. So again, they could be undernourished, they could be undergoing some type of trauma or abuse, they could have other problems that are altering hormone levels, but that's primary amenorrhea. Secondary amenorrhea refers to the absence of normal cyclicities. In other words, the menstrual cycle has begun, but then it's interrupted for whatever reason, and I'm sure you're aware of anything from diet can affect that to hyperactivity. By hyperactivity, I don't mean a psychological disorder. We're talking about athlete syndrome, for example. I used to teach a nutrition class at USF years ago, in which, for some reason, most of the female track students took that course, and typically weighed 105 pounds. But how many calories did they eat a day, do you think? I know this because they would have to turn in diet logs. 5,000? Yeah, 6,000 or so calories a day. It was just incredible. But often they did have problems with the ovarian cycle, menstrual cycle. Why would that be? Well, probably, yeah, but more directly, that would in turn be occasioned by just the extraordinary stress, physiological stress. So illness can cause disruptions of cyclicity, any number of things, neurological issues, diet. Individuals who do not have an appropriate, as Bob says, body fat or appropriate dietary intake can also suffer secondary memory. There are a number of pathologies, again, psychological stress, eating disorders, adrenal or endocrine illness, polycystic ovarian disease. In polycystic ovarian disease, what are the cysts that are being described here? What is the cyst in polycystic? They're the follicles. They just have ceased to be functional follicles, so that's the term they use. We've talked about menopause, the cessation of the female reproductive cycle. We've indicated that gonadotropin levels go up and estrogen levels go down. And as a consequence of that, there can be any number of symptoms, hot flashes, which as a PA, you're going to find, some folks find absolutely insufferable. And they're going to come to you for relief. And how are you going to relieve their hot flashes, the changes that perhaps occur in superficial reproductive tissues, dryness, and so on? How are you going to address that? What could you do? HRT, hormone replacement therapy. 20 years ago, that would have been, everybody would have agreed that's the thing to do. Since then, the thinking has changed. So, is hormone replacement, estrogen replacement therapy in this case, appropriate? Is it an appropriate therapy for someone who comes to you with these symptoms? I guess what I want you to think about is, in large part, the decision you make on a topic like that is going to be based upon the relative suffering of the individual, and you have to weigh the side effects. Are there any side effects? Are there any downsides to hormone replacement therapy? What would be the side effects? 20 years ago, there were none, as far as we knew. Estrogen replacement therapy was believed to decrease osteoporosis, was thought to decrease your risk of cardiovascular disease, was thought to decrease all types of cancer, was thought to be protective for Alzheimer's disease. Sounds like a win-win for me. So what have we learned since then? It doesn't do a lot of that stuff. A lot of the original findings that put an end to HRT, I think some of that wariness has dissipated. For example, is there an increased risk of all types of cancers in estrogen replacement therapy? For example, we talked about the contraceptive pill. That's a sort of supplemental primary hormone. Are there any increased risks with that? What does the research show? And who needs to know that more than me? Because people are going to be coming to you for that type of counsel. My point here, you're going to learn that later in your clinical courses, but my point here is that we don't think the risk of cancer is as great as it used to be. Probably elevated somewhat for breast cancer, but reduced for some of the cervical and other types of cancer. Probably doesn't help with osteoporosis or dementia to the extent that we once thought, although it may be somewhat protective. If I were to ask you why women outlive men, what would you tell me? By the way, that happens across the board. Female babies do better. Females in gestation do better. Female teenagers do better. That's pretty easy one, isn't it? Female adults, and of course, do better as well. So why would that be? Anybody have any? No one has any?
Females doesn't have to deal with females.
I'm sorry?
Women have to deal with females.
Oh.
It's a joke.
Yeah, you can imagine why I will not entertain that answer. Um, But most folks say it's estrogen. Isn't estrogen just a simple answer? Isn't estrogen protective for all these things? It would be, I suppose, if what I told you earlier were not the case, that again, at virtually every demographic level, females do better than males. And not at each of those levels, there's not the same difference between estrogen and testosterone levels. So the answer is we really don't know. We used to think we did. We used to say that it was estrogen. That's what you'll still read in the textbooks quite a bit, but I don't think the evidence supports that. But it'd be an interesting topic for somebody to research, look into. So here's just a list of the important hormones that you should be familiar with. Now, we've talked about estrogens in a number of these slides. We've used the term estradiol and estrogen interchangeably. Note that estradiol is the most potent species of estrogen, and it's the most abundant in the premenopausal female. Estriol levels, another variant of estrogen, increases chiefly during pregnancy, and then estrone tends to peak in the postmenopausal woman, and it's the least potent. There are a number of reasons why that occurs. It has to do with changing fat tissue levels and so on. I think I changed, did I not change this word? What do you have in your notes? Is that what you? Yeah, progestins, yeah. So you should know as a PA that the term progestin and progestogens are often used interchangeably, but technically, progestins are synthetic progesterone. Progestins are synthetic progesterone. So I should have used this term instead, progestogens. As I say, most of the literature I look at, I see them used interchangeably, but that's a point of pedantry that you should be familiar with. We've seen this before. If you go back and look at your steroidogenic charts, I've given you at least 4 or 5 different slides in which you can see the steroidogenic pathways for production of cortisol and aldosterone, estrogen, and testosterone. Well, you'll notice that right after pregnenolone, this is the next step in most of those pathways. In the female, we've indicated that these hormones come from where? Got to be careful here. So these are the androgens. Where do the androgens come from in the female? Right? Okay, the adrenal cortex. And we have to be careful here. So certainly that would be true for DHEA and androstenedione. Those are the weak or non-primary androgens. But what about testosterone and DHT? Where else have we learned? What's the site of? Is there gonadal production of testosterone in the female? Yes. By what cells? Fecal cells, right? So make sure. And sometimes that can be that can have pathological consequences. And then also testosterone and DHT are converted peripherally by a variety of enzymes, especially in fat tissue. I don't know if we have time to get into that in here, but I just want you to be aware that all of these androgens can be present in the female in varying amounts depending upon the relative health of various tissues. Inhibins, activins are also present. We talked about these being gonadal peptides, also going to be present in the ovaries. And then there's a whole soup of other chemicals which we don't need to worry too much about, growth factors and also sort of immunological hormones that are released from the ovary. So we talked about the female androgens. I just want you to be aware that they're really 2 important sites. We talked about, remember this term, what was that? You see what I've written there? Adrenarche. That's the stage that precedes menarche, usually at what age? Maybe 7, 8, 9 years, something like that. When there's elevated activity of the adrenocortical hormones. We did talk about peripheral conversion of the weak androgens into testosterone and DHT. And I also mentioned this before too. You should be aware that females have higher total SHBG levels, such that if the testosterone levels are increased, sometimes that additional testosterone, for whatever reason it may be increased, can get sponged up by the SHBG And that may be a good thing therapeutically or biologically, or it may just confound your analysis and make it more difficult for you to assess the actual problem. Well, I think Curran wants to come in here, so you can talk with him, I guess.
Hey guys, real quick, since you guys don't have your leadership established yet, you will next week, there's a couple things. The cleaning ladies, their job is literally to like sweep up, throw away the trash and stuff like that. Not saying it's all you, but the dishes are starting to get like out of hand, and the school, they can take away that sink, and then there won't be any dishes like used on campus anymore, so that gets kind of annoying. And then, I'm not sure if it was one of you guys, maybe it was, but there was an exploded Coke in the freezer, and that's okay, but just like clean it up, you know? So, you know, if you guys do make a mess, just clean up after yourselves, or the school will kind of like come down and take it away from us, and we don't want that to happen for us and, you know, future classes too. So just keep in mind that if you're adults, clean up after yourself. So, all right? Thank you. Sorry.
He spoke that word. And then he said that he sees